As photographers, portrait photography is usually one of the first types of photography we experiment with. The preservation of movement and human expression in a single frame has always drawn us to the art of portrait photography. And as a portrait photographer myself, when I enter a portrait session, I often find that I need to remind myself of the meaning and the why behind the portrait photography session. As with anything in life, it can be easy to forget the end goal and why we do something. If you don't know what something is and what something stands for, how can you build or create towards it? It is only until you know what the end goal looks like and why you are doing something that you can break the goal down into individual pieces and work from there. With that being said, let's take a closer look at what portrait photography is and the meaning behind it. Portrait photography is about capturing the essence, personality, identity, and attitude of a person using background, lighting, and posing. While this definition may sound simple, portrait photography can be one of the most challenging forms of photography to master. The goal is to capture a photo that appears both natural and prepared to allow the subject's personality to shine through. As long as a portrait photographer can effectively capture the subject's character, the equipment he or she uses does not really matter. While it always helps to have equipment that is state of the art, it's not really needed. This leads us to our next point. What does a portrait photographer actually do? I believe the role of a portrait photographer is to accomplish 4 tasks within the session. The first and most obvious is that the portrait photographer is responsible for taking pictures of their subject. But it should not be solely for the enjoyment of the portrait photographer. The subject should enjoy the photos as well. Portrait photographers also need to find the best background and location in order for the portraits to be taken in. The photographer can choose to shoot their portrait photograph within a studio, or they can choose to find a location outside of a studio through location scouting. A popular choice within portrait photography is a plain background within a studio setting. This is ideal for most traditional portrait photographers because it allows them to isolate their subjects and eliminate any distracting background elements. The other option is to find a location outside of a studio. By photographing outside of a studio, the photographer can introduce creative elements that can help reflect the character and personality of their subject, allowing the viewer to get a better sense of the person within the photograph. Whichever location the photographer chooses, it's important to make sure that the focus is on the subject and not necessarily the background or the setting of the image. Lighting a portrait photograph is one of the most crucial aspects of portrait photography, as different lighting setups can create a whole different attitude and emotion of the portrait. Most portrait photographers do not rely on the camera's built-in flash, and instead either use natural light or studio lights and reflectors. If the photographer is shooting within a studio, he or she may use a combination of reflectors paired with out-of-camera lights to illuminate the model. If studio lighting is not available, or that is not their style, they may opt for a naturally lit portrait photograph. When this is the case, the portrait photographer relies on the natural light of the sun. This requires greater knowledge of daylight timing and body positioning in order to produce effective natural light portrait photography, and if performed correctly, can produce beautiful portraits. Most portrait photographers also provide their subjects with posing tips. Lastly, they also edit and print the photos to give to their clients or deliver them electronically. A question often asked is, what exactly makes a photo a portrait, and why do we even need portrait photography? I believe a photo becomes a portrait when the subject, along with the background, lighting, and emotion, can evoke a sense of connection between the viewer and the portrait photograph. A candid photo is not necessarily a portrait, but most candid portraits are often the best. When it comes to the necessity of portraits, the need for a good portrait can be seen within the sharing of work. Photographers share their work with their audience in order to uncover a sense of connected emotion within them. The audience could be the photographer themselves enjoying portrait photography for their own hobby or enjoyment, or it could be the family of a client whose portraits you photographed. It is a balance between satisfying your own personal self and creativity while also satisfying and meeting the needs of the client. A portrait photographer has a lot of power in deciding how they want their audience to feel when they view their portraits. And that leads us to the importance of portrait photography. Portrait photography can be important for many reasons, and those reasons could vary from individual to individual. A portrait photograph may be important for historic preservation, personal branding, or for personal enjoyment. With the rise of digital platforms, we're often faced with portraits everywhere we turn, from profile pictures on social media, to potential partners on dating sites, to faces on a screen that we interact with on a daily basis. There is no one reason why portrait photography is important. Just like any other form of art, it can be hard to explain why it's important. The reasons stated previously may suffice in answering this question. Perhaps it is the connection a good portrait photograph can bring to the viewer that makes portrait photography an unexplainable need among the masses. The emotions and feelings that can be evoked through a good portrait photograph reside in each one of us, and only when we see it through a good portrait can we connect with that feeling on a deeper level. Perhaps it's just a photo in a frame or on a screen, or perhaps it's a mirror to how we are feeling inside. Only you can know.